right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the fourth Connex of the year. We started the year with a deep dive into the situation in Afghanistan. Then we took kind of a more relaxed route with a cooking show, which many of you enjoyed. And then we dipped into crypto a month ago. And tonight we're going to dip into an issue that's important to all of us and especially important to our children. And that is the environment that we live in and how we as human beings are impacting that environment and some things we're going to need to do if we are going to continue to have a planet that supports 7 billion of us around the world. And we have an amazing panel of experts that Katie Friedland has put together. I also want to acknowledge Katie's work. She's been key at making these connects happen. And I thanked our panelists before we came on live for joining us. But I said to them, I know they really didn't have a choice once Katie began the pursuit. So they could have tried to say no. But over to Katie for introductions. Again, thank you to the panelists and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Steve. I'm really excited about this topic and it feels so timely. We have 4 SCH parents here with us today who are really at the heart of addressing climate change. And our moderator tonight is Dr. Vanessa Chan, and we have 3 panelists, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, Alyssa Edwards, and Aaron Ratner. And we have emailed out their bios, so I know you've all read them. And I'd rather really have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about, how they got into this job and how they, how they wound up in this field. So Vanessa, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I am the Chief Commercialization Officer and the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions for the Department of Energy. And I was appointed by President Biden to this job in January 2021. And in terms of what I do at DOE, we invest billions every year in 17 national labs across our nation, from Silicon Valley to Chicago to Princeton. And the DOE is actually the coolest place for inventing new technologies. Our DOE labs invented MRIs. We built the Mars rover. NASA helped us launch it. Sandia National Labs actually built it. We developed new materials such as lead-free solder, which is in every single electronic device in the world. We're also building the world's first exascale computers. We have 5 quantum centers. We're discovering new technologies for hydrogen production, battery storage, advanced nuclear reactors, and all these things could save our environment. And we're also inventing new manufacturing processes for things like wind turbines. And really my job is to commercialize these technologies, which means getting them out of the lab and translate it into real world products. And we do that by working with industry, venture capitals, other countries, and other parts of the US government to do it. We also fund incubators, accelerator programs across the US to support startups who are working on clean energy technologies. And we also help to shape policies that support bringing new technologies to the real world. And just last week, the White House released a report that my team wrote on how to build the competitiveness of the US supply chain in response to an executive order from President Biden. So in terms of how I got here, similar to many of you in the audience tonight, my path started as a high school student studying science. And in particular, I really loved chemistry, which led to my majoring material science and engineering and getting a PhD from MIT in that topic. But my career is really focused at the interface of innovation and business. And how do you get technologies actually translated into products? Research on its own is great, but it won't lead to real world impact on its own. And my career really has been focused on how do you get this stuff out of the lab into the real world. And I have a big secret for all of you who are listening, who are students at SCH, is that you are already way ahead of the game. One of the programs that I run at DOE is Energy I-Core, which is to teach the scientists and engineers at my 17 national labs entrepreneurial skills. So to have an impact through science, you have to talk to the outside world, you have to understand the problem, and then you aim your technology prowess at it. Unfortunately, you do not learn this in undergrad or PhDs, science and engineering programs, but you do learn this at SCH through the CEL curriculum that Mr. Glassman and his team have developed. So I can't wait for many of you to become scientists and engineers, because as graduates of SCH, you already have the mindset that we need on how to have an impact in the world and the environment. And with that, I want to introduce our very first panelist, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, who is also a Biden appointee and who I had not met until our current jobs, and who knew there were 2 SCH moms who are both Penn engineering professors who are fated to work together at the Department of Energy. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thanks for having me here today, everybody. Really excited to share my story with you and to have this discussion. And to just give you a little background, I'm actually also, just like Vanessa said, a political appointee for the Biden-Harris administration, started on January 20th. last year, and I'm currently an assistant secretary for the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Program at the Department of Energy, which means I head up everything that has to do with fossil fuels for the federal government. And hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about the technologies that we're excited about and some of the work that we're doing to impact climate. But one of the things I just wanted to bring up, and I'll talk a tiny little bit about my background too, but this last week has been really challenging for all of us. And a lot of what my office is doing, and you've probably seen on the news with the war in the Ukraine, is recently we actually released 30 million barrels of oil from our strategic petroleum reserves in the United States. And that's something that my office oversaw over this last week. And we also authorize all of the exports of liquefied natural gas across the US. And my background is I grew up in rural Maine. And so I have a very, to my core, huge care for the planet, and also making sure that we really live in a sustainable way. And so I spent my career recognizing our dependence on fossil fuels, but recognizing that the impact that our dependence has had on our planet, on our ecosystems, on humanity. And so really all the way from being young and interested in science and engineering and growing up in a household where my parents were a social worker and a teacher, I ended up going into the field of becoming a chemical engineering professor, but really focusing on the environment and sustainability. And one of the things that I've recognized in these last couple of weeks is just really our stronghold on fossil fuel and its dependence. And if we can wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, there's so much on the other side. And the thing that I want to point out is, we often talk about, like in New England, for instance, where I'm from, cold winters and the price of gas. And we talk about when we fill up our gas tanks and the volatility of the market in terms of gasoline prices. But if we were to switch to infrastructure focused on green, electrons from renewables that couple to heat pumps for heating, then we wouldn't be so dependent, and we wouldn't worry about the fluctuation of prices, and we wouldn't see some of the same control that we see in the Ukraine today and the power that fossil fuels have in the dependence that they lead us to. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is really straddling this path of trying to minimize the impacts of our dependence on the planet, but at the same time realizing that we still are dependent upon them today and that transition is going to take time. And so I know we're going to get a little bit more into this in the discussion, but that's a little bit of my background and really excited to just share my expertise and experience with you guys today.
Thanks, Jen. I'd like to hand it over now to Alyssa Edwards to introduce herself.
Well, hey everyone, I'm Alyssa Edwards. So good to be here. This seminar is just right up my alley. Just a little bit about my background. I think, really looking back, my passion since high school has really been the environment. I think even in, the 1990s, I could see that environmental conservation and climate change really is one of the biggest challenges of our lifetimes, and certainly that of our kids and future generations. I've really always felt the urgency around that. I was thinking about this talk and what had such a profound impact on me. And I thought about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, if anybody remembers that book from the 60s, before my time, and also reading Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And both of those books had such a profound impact on me. And I always knew that, my professional and personal life would have this as a focus. So, in terms of education, I went to Lehigh for undergrad in environmental science. I went to the London School of Economics for environmental economics. And I was also sort of remembering that I had an uncle back in 2005 when I graduated from grad school who said, Alyssa, what are you going to do with those degrees? You're not going to be employable at all. So, that was maybe a little bit of that mindset back then. Obviously he doesn't think that now. But so, professionally, I've worked in renewable energy for around 17 years, developing and deploying utility scale wind and solar projects. So utility means that I work, I build large scale projects that interconnect directly to the electricity grid. So the difference then would be, the solar that you see on rooftops or on, sort of smaller projects. We call those distributed generation. Maybe you'd see them in a school or a home or something like that. And utility scale is defined as really 10 megawatts or greater. But usually what we're seeing on the landscape now is really like, minimum 50, but usually most, big utility scale wind and solar projects are larger than 100 megawatts. And I'm always asked, what is a megawatt? What does it mean? And, there's a few estimates out there, and I know the DOE folks know all about this, but, usually a 1 megawatt really means like 160 US homes could provide electricity for about 165 US homes for a year. So I love working in renewable energy. It's my passion. I love it because, it's part of the solution, for climate change. So in my current role, I'm Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Government Relations. So in that role, I run our sustainability and biodiversity programs. And then I also do state and federal legislative and regulatory matters. And this is where I intersect with DOE. Actually, just talked to them yesterday. And the company I work for is Lightsource BP, which I think is interesting in itself because we are a 50-50 JV with BP, the oil super major. And we can talk about it a little more later, but I just so firmly believe that we need the oil super majors for the energy transition, for all of their infrastructure and their resources and their lobbying ability. So, I think that's really important. And just one last thing about me, I'm also really involved locally with Friends of the Wissahickon. I'm board president, and I've been involved with the board and the organization for like 7 or 8 years. I know that the Wissahickon and the park is such an incredible resource to our school and our, so many Philadelphia communities. So that's also really important to me. And so thanks, really happy to be here and passing it on to Aaron Ratner.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here, and it's great to be on this panel with such amazing people. So I'm Aaron Ratner. I'm the founder and managing partner of the Carbon Foundry. We are a multi-strategy investment and project development platform focusing on climate and the energy transition. We have 3 main businesses. We have a venture capital fund that invests in early stage technologies focusing on climate and agriculture technology. Those investments include things like BeeFlow, which is one of the most advanced pollination technology providers in the world. This is a company that helps bees live longer, healthier lives and helps them pollinate more efficiently, which results in more crop yield per acre for almond farmers and avocado farmers and berry farmers, and also reduces the quantity of ugly fruit, which can't be sold in Whole Foods and the stores where most of us buy our produce. We also invested in a company called 12, which is a carbon dioxide utilization company that takes CO2 and turns it into chemicals for industrial use. The long-term business plan there will be to take atmospheric CO2 on Mars and turn it into breathable oxygen and plastics for materials for humans to use. But in the meantime, they're taking carbon dioxide from factories and turning it into part of the supply chain and decarbonizing their supply chain. Another business that we're in is the sustainable infrastructure development and engineering business. We have a strategic partnership with the leading firm in that sector. We've developed projects like an advanced small nuclear reactor company in New Brunswick, Canada. We have a project capturing 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide from one of the largest cement production facilities in America out in Colorado. We're developing a hydrogen station at an airport that wants to become the first fully decarbonized airport in North America. And we spent a lot of time in sustainable protein, which is mostly around producing alternatives for livestock feed and then dealing with livestock waste. And one of my little known facts is that I was one of the founding members of something called the Manure Innovation Challenge, which my wife actually never talks about for some reason. And then our third part of our business is called Special Opportunities. Last week, we raised a $230 million special purpose acquisition company. My partner in that is Nicholas Parker. He's the one of the founders of the clean tech movement. He actually coined the term clean energy 20 years ago. And we've gone out, we're going to go find and merge with a company and take it public and hopefully catalyze it into the climate and energy transition. So, we spend our time sort of turning and looking at the climate problem from multiple angles. We have people who think very long-term. Often they're really young and really smart, like everyone else in this panel, and they're thinking about technology and where it's all going and taking a very long-term view. We also take a very pragmatic view that we have to start now and we have to start making real changes now. So these projects need to be developed and they need to be constructed immediately and as soon as possible, because this energy transition that we're in right now is very capital intensive. There are trillions of dollars of projects that need to be developed and built in order for this to be successful. It's not all going to be able to be done in software. And then, of course, there needs to be lots of capital deployed as well, which we think about how to catalyze, platforms in order to get a lot of private and government money out into the climate and energy transition. I got into this really through a love of nature. I grew up outside of Boston. My parents spent a lot of time in the forest with me, and I climb a lot of mountains in my free time, and always had a real respect for Mother Nature as well as reverence for it. And that continues to today. And I spent most of my childhood focusing on that. And then in high school, I took a physics class and really liked it, but I was terrible at it. And I was terrible at chemistry and math, and I was a little dyslexic, so reading wasn't my strong point. But I could sell rocks to my neighbor. And so I realized I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I went out and I moved to Hong Kong. I spent 8 years in Hong Kong. I went to Stanford for business school. And when I got out, ended up getting into the impact space and working on impact and sustainable infrastructure, and I've really been doing it ever since and never looked back. And it's really been it's been a really fulfilling experience for me. And I always tell young people when I meet them that since the day I started working on the climate, I've never actually gone to work. I love what I do, and it's really exciting, and it's a great adventure, and there's more and more people coming into it. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing sort of what I do and discussing with the rest of the panel.
Awesome. Well, I mean, this is an incredible panel. And this is one of the reasons why I love SCH, is because of the parents and community that we have here that really are making a difference in the world around them. And we actually have the perfect group to actually talk about technologies and the impact on the climate, because really when you think about commercializing technologies, there's kind of three legs of the stool. You need the technology and regulatory, which Jen brings in spades with all the research she's done as a chemical engineering professor and the work she's now doing at the DOE. You need to finance it, which is, Aaron, what you've been thinking about for many years. And we need private-public partnerships, which is, Alyssa, what you've been driving. And so it's really great to have all of that represented in just 3 SCH parents. So I wanted to start by level setting everyone on some key facts and terms when it comes to climate change, because there's a lot of things that float around. And so I really want to start with you, Alyssa, to have you talk a little bit about what are the biggest sources of emissions today and how do they contribute to climate change? And then maybe bring it a little bit closer to home, talk a little bit, how do we get our energy in the US and in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, sure. So I heard a comment last week, and it might have been speaking with all of you, which is turning on the light switch is not going out of style, and certainly driving cars is not going out of style either. And so I always kind of think about that, and I always tell my kids, think about what this means when you leave the lights on, for example, right? But in terms of, percentages of, in the US, the greenhouse gas emissions, probably no surprise, the transportation sector is the biggest source percentage wise. It's around 30%. Electricity generation is just below that at around 25%, burning natural gas and coal. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but, that's sort of the 2 biggest drivers of energy generation in the US. Industrial activities, so producing goods from raw materials, that's another quarter, another 25%. And then the rest is, residential and commercial, and then agriculture. I think the last one, agriculture, maybe, I know I didn't used to really think so much about that, but I know the Biden administration has a pretty big focus right now on ag. Livestock and agricultural practices, produce methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so, and Aaron mentioned this, there's technologies around this, and we're trying to, deal with that source of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's maybe sort of in the last decade, that recognition is there. In terms of the electricity generation, electricity sector, we're largely natural gas, around 30% in the US. Petroleum is a little less than 30%, like 28%. Coal right now in the US, we're around 17%, which is definitely down from, past times historically, which is a good thing. I had to look this up today. Renewable energy is up to 12.7% of total US generation, which is progress, I guess. And then nuclear, nuclear's there, nuclear's on, it's always on if it's available. And that's around, 10%. And then just in terms of Pennsylvania, I do a lot of work across all through the US, but particularly in PA, we have this coal producing history, right? And it's actually very, very cultural and social in a way. And then we have, Marcellus Shale, which is, the largest gas field in the country. And I talk to state legislators about the energy transition all the time. But just sort of for comparison, in Pennsylvania, natural gas, we're over 50%. We're actually a big natural gas producer. This is largely due to Marcellus Shale. Nuclear is around 25%, and wind is 4%, solar is 8%, and then coal has dropped to 10%, which is actually so incredibly significant in Pennsylvania if you look at our past.
That's exciting. And I think this is a perfect segue, Jen, because, you lead the fossil energy and carbon management group at DOE. And so would love to learn a little bit more about, what have you done? You've done a lot of changes since you joined DOE, and talk a little about the Biden administration, right? What are some of the goals that we've launched, and what's it that we're trying to really drive towards?
Absolutely. And thank you for all of that, Alyssa. That was great. So the Biden administration has some significant climate goals. The focus of the administration is really on climate. And the biggest one is achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But there's two near-term goals that we're hoping to be able to achieve to get us on that path. And one is 50% emissions reduction by 2030, which is less than a decade away. And then there's also 100% clean electricity by 2035. And so, the Department of Energy has a lot of different offices. We have an applied office that focuses on nuclear as part of the portfolio to getting to net zero. Another office focused on energy efficiency and renewable energies, which is, a lot of what Alyssa is focusing on as well. But then we also have to recognize what net zero means. We have to recognize that we do, as I mentioned before, have a dependence on fossil fuels today, but we don't want to think about, and I'll just add too, we have technologies to decarbonize fossil fuels, but we don't want to think of carbon capture, which is the technology that I can talk about. We don't want to think of that as a blanket solution for all fossil fuels. What we would rather see is a build out of renewables for the reasons that I painted at the beginning when I was doing my introduction, because the dependence that we have on fossil fuels just has so many other negative impacts, not to mention the Marcellus that Alyssa mentioned. When we extract fossil fuels out of the earth, there's so many ecosystem and environmental impacts that are negative to the planet. And so CCS and carbon capture and storing the carbon permanently is a solution for only some of the pieces, and we're focusing on specifically committed emissions. So if you look at, for instance, the coal-fired power plants, many of them are actually looking at retirement over the next decade. We would never want to retrofit something that's going to retire over the next decade. And I know Aaron's going to talk about financing, and it's like a lot of these technologies are financed over 2 decades. So you don't want to lock in technology over 2 decades if it's going to retire sooner than that. And so what we're looking at is decarbonization of things like brand new natural gas fired power plants, for instance, that are expected to persist through mid-century. And so our office is really looking at expanding and beyond carbon capture on coal, for instance, and looking at natural gas fired power that's expected to persist. And then the industrial sector. In the industrial sector, again, capturing the carbon at the exhaust stream isn't always the best solution, but it is for a sector like cement. And when you make some of these products like cement and steel and pulp and paper, it's not just about burning fossil fuels to get the energy to make those products, but also the products themselves. There's a chemical reaction that produces CO2. When we make cement, you're taking limestone from the earth and you're heating it to really high temperatures, and through a chemical reaction, that calcium carbonate turns into lime and carbon dioxide. And you're also in the same furnace heating fossil fuels to produce the heat to do that reaction. And so carbon capture captures both the process, the chemical emissions, and also the thermal from the fossil. So it is a good solution for that sector. And you can't just replace that with renewables, for instance, like you can with the power sector. And so a lot of what we're doing is really just looking at not a blanket solution of carbon capture, but really focusing on the sectors that are expected to persist. And just one last bit is when you look at things that are very difficult to decarbonize today, like agriculture and methane emissions, there's another tool that we have in the kit, and that's called carbon dioxide removal. And this is where we're looking at the accumulated pool of CO2 that's in the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we have the ability and the technologies to take that CO2 back out of the atmosphere. It's hard, and you want to avoid it in the first place if you can help it. But for really, truly hard to decarbonize sectors like agriculture, like aviation and shipping today, we do have this tool, and we are also investing in that as well at DOE.
Jen, I just want to go backwards to kind of what the opening statements I made was around net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Can you explain what that means? That may be a new term to many people listening.
Sure. Yeah. So net zero essentially means that whatever we put in the atmosphere, if we want to get to net zero, we've got to take it back out. And one thing that a lot of, I think that's important to a point to raise is that we actually have trees, of course, that take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we have the ocean as well. And the ocean, of course, is experiencing this through acidification. And so it turns out that globally, we emit roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 every year. But the terrestrial biosphere and the oceans actually take care of half of those emissions for us today. But you can imagine the other 20 gigatons has just been accumulating in the air. And so what net zero is going to mean is starting from today, or maybe January 20th, 2021, when we began in the Biden-Harris administration, starting on that day, or when we made the pledge to get to net zero by 2050, what that means is everything we put in the atmosphere, we have to pull back out outside of those natural sources. What that also means is when we experience forest fires, we're relying on forests as being sinks today. And so when forest fires take place, now these sinks are becoming sources, and that could all change as we experience more warming. And so it's just net zero just means anything you put in the atmosphere, you've got to take back out aside from those natural sinks that are helping us out.
So turn off lights, as Alyssa said, and plant more trees is a big part of this.
But it's a portfolio, so you just can't plant trees. It's not enough. We need to do everything.
Yep.
Everything. Yep.
And Erin, you had such a good intro in terms of all the technologies that you're investing in, right? And not to put you on the spot, but what are your favorite ones, right? And which ones do you think are the most important to get us to some of the goals that Jen's talking about?
I think they're all really important. It's sort of like arrows in a quiver, and they all need to work. When you're in a battle, you reach behind you grab an arrow, you can't be picky, right? And it takes all types, and it takes all sorts of people. We need people working on carbon for sure. As an example, I spent a lot of time working on that very large cement production facility in Colorado that's going to emit a lot of CO2, 1.5 million tons a year. That's 1 ton of CO2 is about the size of a house, right? So that's 5,000 a day coming into the air. So it's an incredible amount. And that's just one cement facility of thousands around the world. And so there are a lot of people spending a lot of money and time engineering a carbon capture facility there to take the CO2 and then stick it under the ground permanently. But you also need young, brilliant scientists like a fellow named Cody Fink out in California at a company called Brimstone, who looked at that problem and said, well, okay, yeah, CO2 emissions are a problem, but what if we used an input that didn't emit CO2? What if we didn't have CaCO3, calcium chloride? So, he's working on replacing that with a material that isn't going to emit carbon at all when that cement is manufactured. And so you need to have, people working on the problem today, but these are multi-decade, trillion-dollar problems. And so we have to get started, but we also need people looking very long-term. So I think that the carbon space in particular is really important. Carbon sort of comprises almost everything we do and eat. It's really quite ubiquitous. It's a part of everything. So carbon management is really critical, and people over time will become more cognizant of their carbon production and their carbon consumption and their carbon waste. And eventually we'll all kind of have a pretty good sense of, just like we know how much we weigh and what our heart rate is and our blood pressure is, we'll probably know what our carbon footprint is, and hopefully not have to share it with other people unless we're managing it well. So I think, carbon's big. Also, agriculture is really big. The pollination investment that we made, a huge percentage of the food in our food chain needs to be pollinated. Bees are in trouble. And, the human capacity to forget about really critical issues is quite good. The brain is a very powerful filter, and pollination in particular, and our reliance on bees to pollinate our food is important. It's critical to our food chain, and bees get treated very poorly in the environment, both from pesticides, from wireless communication, and just the way they're handled. So, I think it's the whole thing. It's agriculture, it's carbon management, renewable fuels, and the way we commute. Jen mentioned airlines and negative emissions and carbon capture. We are working on a project right now that's called Beck's Bioenergy with carbon capture, where you take massive amounts of wood. Trees happen to be very good carbon capture devices, and you gasify them, and you take most of the carbon that you've gasified, you stick it underground permanently, and you take a little bit of that carbon and you turn it into what's called sustainable aviation fuel. So a lot of the big airlines now are committing to buying sustainable aviation fuel, because aviation is a very pollutant industry. So really, it's across the board. It's the things that people are looking 20 years out, and it's the things that people can start doing today to start, turning the planet towards a more sustainable future.
That makes a ton of sense. And, we've been looking at electric airplanes. And so there's all kinds of things going on right now. And to your point, it's an entire portfolio of stuff that we're going to have to do to get us to where we need to get to. Alyssa, I want you to bring us back home. Like you started talking a lot about, the US and Pennsylvania. So if you had to think about Pennsylvania locally, right, what are some of the technologies that you think will be critical to Pennsylvania's transition?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned, in PA, wind is about 4% of energy generation. Wind is 4%, solar is about 8%. I guess, having worked in Pennsylvania, I sort of started, building wind farms and stuff in Pennsylvania in 2006, 2005. I think what's most important is sort of deploying the known technologies, like wind and solar, battery storage. We understand them, we know them. There's public support generally for them. I really see the build out of wind and solar as being really critical to helping the country meet, its energy goals. You talked about the Biden administration's goals, but also our own state. I will tell you that I spend a lot of time speaking to legislators, speaking to the environmental conservation community, academics, other stakeholders. And there is, if you think about how much of Pennsylvania is rural, right? There's over, 7+ million acres of farmland in Pennsylvania. And very often we're putting renewable energy, particularly solar, we're putting it on ag land. And the reason why is because it's flat, it's previously disturbed. Oftentimes there's not, major environmental conflicts when we put, solar, for example, on ag land. And, what we're seeing in a lot of states, but sort of just focusing on, Pennsylvania, is issues with land competition, social resistance. And there's such, and it took me a while to understand this, there's such a strong cultural and social nexus with the energy transition. So I'll just tell you, one of the things that I do, which is probably the most fun thing I do in my job, is that we actually implement like dual land use and environmental co-benefits on our utility scale solar projects. So I have this awesome project in Franklin County where we actually pay a local farmer to bring his sheep on. It's called agrivoltaic. So that's the combination of agriculture and solar. And he brings his sheep on the site, and we pay him just like we pay people to come out and mow the vegetation underneath the panels. And it's a diversified source of energy revenue for this farmer. And he said, and I did not provoke this, he said in public that it helped him save his family farm. This is one way that we're helping to bridge sort of the cultural and social and land conflict issue that we see with renewables. And we really see it, around the country. And then also, Aaron, I just wanted to say, A big thing that we do underneath and around our panels is we put, large scale pollinator habitat. In fact, we're working with DOE's Solar Energy Technologies Office for a project in Indiana. We've got a bee yard. We're doing all these studies on, pollinator habitat combined with, large scale solar. So, I mean, I guess all this to say, Pennsylvania, but other places as well, there is a social resistance, and I've come to understand it. And we're working really hard as an industry to have an agricultural integration that is sort of publicly acceptable, but also, brings more value other than just clean renewable energy, adds biodiversity and agriculture and, supports the local economy as well.
I'm so glad to hear that. I don't know if you guys ever saw the Black Mirror episode with the drone bees. I'm glad that you guys are going to prevent us from going to, if you haven't seen it, Alyssa and Aaron, you guys have to watch it. It's like where technology goes wrong. No one's mentioned nuclear yet. So just wanted to kind of throw it out there to the panel. What do you think the role that nuclear power should be playing in the transitioning? And I guess, Aaron, you have investment, in nuclear. So we'll maybe start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So we partnered with a company called ARC Clean Energy that has a small advanced nuclear power technology. That one of the most challenging things about nuclear power is actually making it very small and compact. And also, of course, you have to figure out something to do with the fuel. And there are technology companies, ARC, there's another one called Moltex, that are figuring out now how to create nuclear reactors, put the fuel in, and effectively teach the reactor how to consume all the fuel, so that 40 years later, there's nothing left in the tank, effectively eliminating nuclear waste. And in fact, one of those companies is starting to try to figure out how to make nuclear power plants using nuclear waste. So you can take a long-term vision and think about going to all the big nuclear waste facilities and pulling that waste out and actually turning it into clean energy. So there's a real positive future there. Also, folks may have seen in the news recently, there's some pretty interesting investments going into nuclear fusion, which is sort of taking, getting more out of less, and big, smart investors putting lots of capital into that. So that could actually become something. In both of those fields, there's really zero room for error, right? One of the things about nuclear power plants is they historically have been more expensive than they should have been, but also sometimes they have problems. And when they do, and they spill into the environment, that's a very lasting issue, whether it's here in the US or elsewhere, like Chernobyl, which has been in the news recently. So it's a technology that if we figure it out at the right scale and cost, can be part of the solution, particularly in areas where renewables are going to suffer. So up north, where there isn't particularly good wind, where there isn't enough solar, where there might not be enough hydropower, there are parts of the world where nuclear will be really efficacious, but it just has to be managed in a way where the projects are designed for zero error outcome, because when they do go sideways, they have very lasting impacts.
Yeah, and over 50% of the nation's 100% clean energy is coming from nuclear, so it's a really, really key part of it. And for those who have been following the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a $6 billion credit, civil nuclear credit program to make sure that the current fleet, which is 93 reactors, stays operating, because I think it's really important for us to get to our net zero. And I think this is a kind of a good segue to talk a little bit about financing, and actually wanted to talk first about kind of subsidies, right? Because Jen, this is something that is important, and you've been thinking about it. So I'd love for you to explain, what are the role of subsidies, like the ones I just talked about in nuclear, and what are some of the work that you've done with the executive order from the president on preventing fossil fuel subsidies?
Sure. Yeah, so there was an executive order, or is an executive order. Our mission, actually, previously to me coming on at the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, the mission previously was associated with increasing the efficiency of how we produce fossil fuels today. And in the past year, we've done such a significant reorganization of our office, more so than its inception in 1977, because really this executive order says that, we can't promote fossil fuels and we can't subsidize them. And so really what we're investing in now is associated with minimizing the environmental and climate impacts of how we produce fossil fuels today. And so in the infrastructure law, how I see it, and you mentioned this, Vanessa, I think $62 billion through the infrastructure law to the Department of Energy. For the carbon management work, which spans all the way from, again, not a blanket solution, committed emissions in a responsible way to think about citing carbon capture, first of a kind technologies and demonstrations for not just the industrial sector and some of the natural gas-fired power plants, but also the carbon removal approaches that we were talking about, like direct air capture, for instance. All of these these are first of a kind projects. And when you look at them, they're very expensive for first of a kind projects, and they're large scale. So anywhere from hundreds of millions of dollars per project to up to $1 billion per project. And in total, we have about $12 billion through the infrastructure law to do these. What that is, though, is it's really just planting the seeds of a foundation, and it's the first step. And so what we really need is the private sector to be able to come in and take some of those first of a kind demonstrations and take this and repeat those technologies, learn by doing, get down the cost curve for second of a kind, third of a kind. But guess what? It's still not enough. It's still expensive. And so we are reliant on tax credits. And there's a 45Q tax credit that today provides up to $50 per ton of carbon captured if it's to be captured and put, as Aaron mentioned, underground, deep underground in a reliable way, so that it doesn't come back up. And if we can get the Build Back Better through, it's going to be bumped up even higher. In fact, we need it to be in order to be able to support the private sector for taking the next demonstrations to ultimately get to wide scale deployment, which we'll need in order for carbon management to be part of the portfolio. And not just for the avoiding the emissions of the atmosphere, but actually having to take them back out as well.
That's really helpful. As I think about commercialization, the way, I've been defining it across DOE and the US government is we're going from research to development to demonstration to deployment. And, as the steward of kind of the RDD&D continuum, it's really important to ask ourselves, how do we use that $62 billion to buy down the risk on demonstration so that we can get to the point where the private sector, who has 23 trillion at their disposal, can actually get us to wide scale deployment. And so really it's around what's the risk that the government can do to get the technologies closer to the last stage of commercialization, which is deployment. And Aaron, I'd love for you to talk a little bit as someone who represents the private sector and the 23 trillion is, how do you think about the energy transition and financing of it? And I think it would be helpful, first of all, explain to this group the concept of financing and how you're thinking about it in the context of the clean energy transition.
Sure. So I'll speak to the private finance side of it, not to the government philanthropic. There's a whole spectrum, right? There's philanthropic capital, wealthy families and foundations and endowments giving money to entrepreneurs. There's a tremendous amount of venture capital money flowing into climate and the energy transition. Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, the largest asset management firm in the world, came out of the COP26 conference last year, which is a big environmental conference, and said that he thinks many of the next $1,000 billion technology companies will be climate technology companies. And he's probably right about that. So there's a tremendous amount of capital now available to startups to go and try and see if they can make an impact. And that's an amazing thing for young people today. 20 years ago, it was all about the internet and selling ads on Amazon and Google and whatnot. And still today, most of the biggest internet companies are just selling advertisements to eyeballs. But that's changing, and there are a lot of really incredible young people going into the energy transition. And some of them are scientists, some of them are writers, some of them are just entrepreneurs who want to make a difference and want to figure out how to contribute and make a career out of it. So the quantum of venture capital flowing into the space is just staggering. It's growing every quarter by leaps and bounds, and that will catalyze a lot of innovation down the line when those companies get bigger, become more profitable, and then actually start building projects. And as we discussed earlier, and all the things that Jennifer's talking about, all this needs to be built. It's $1 billion of steel and cement and wiring and electronics and plumbing that actually has to be put in place and then has to function properly. And because it needs to function properly, you got to build it right the first time, and that's what's so risky and so expensive about it. So the financing comes from early stage investors. It comes from companies that help other companies grow. There's something called project finance, which is investors who just invest in projects, not in companies. Historically, that's shipping ports and toll roads and things like that, but increasingly those investors are starting to look at the energy transition. And then there's the public markets, and today in the public markets, whether it's public equity or public debt, the ESG label does help securities trade better, and so investors are starting to vote with their portfolios, which is incredibly empowering because that then leads asset managers to go and issue more of that kind of capital. So it's the whole spectrum that's sort of orienting towards profitability and the climate. And that's the real difference. 10 years ago, if you went and tried to speak to the CFO of a major corporation about sustainability, they would sort of roll their eyes and try to figure out how to pawn you off to somebody else. But today, if you're talking about sustainability, you're talking to the CEO and the CFO because you represent a profit opportunity for their company, and they're going to get fired if they don't listen to you. So all that means that there's just a lot of opportunity and a lot of capital flowing in from all directions.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but who thought there'd be this much money for fusion, right? Even 10 years ago. And here at DOE, we have a fusion center that's doing a lot of that research. It's really exciting to see. And so, Alyssa, tell me a little bit about, you've been in this realm for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
How do you think things are different right now? Does it feel different to you? Like, it feels really different to me. I'm curious to see what you think.
Does it feel different? Well, what doesn't feel different is, the struggles that, we face and we talk about every day in the renewable energy sector. Today I probably had 5 conversations about trade and tariffs. That's just a reality. I also had, probably 5 conversations about, proposed legislation, mostly at the state level that are, trying to prohibit and, restrict renewables. I think that, I think renewables, of course, that's my day to day. There's going to be deployment no matter what. I mean, that demand is there. I mean, our customers now are Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Walmart. I mean, all the big corporates, right? That demand is there. I think, the question is sort of, the public investment, the private investment, the subsidies, the tax incentive, it's sort of all the same in a way, right? I mean, it's all sort of helping to, push renewables forward. Jen, you said something that is like very, very near and dear to my heart, related to tax incentives, the investment tax credit, the production tax credit. By the way, this is a big narrative. All forms of energy generation receive some type of tax incentive, tax write-off, subsidy, even oil and gas, from the government. And renewables is no different. Build Back Better, another thing very near and dear to my heart, contains some of those very, very important incentives, for us as an industry. So I don't know, Vanessa, you say, how are things different? Well, look, we're putting a whole lot more renewable energy on the landscape than we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But we have to work to overcome, market challenges, economic challenges, political challenges. I think they're still there.
And just out to the folks listening, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in and we'll add them if we can. And as I wait for questions, I wanted to change gears a little bit into diversity and environmental justice. I would say for far too long, communities of color and low income communities have really borne the brunt of pollution. And so as part of the administration here, there's a Justice 40 initiative where 40% of the overall benefits of climate investments are going to be geared towards impacting disadvantaged communities to really ensure that we have equitable commercialization within the Department of Energy. And so, I'm curious, Aaron, if you can talk a little bit, from an investing side of it, are you seeing those kind of commitments towards diversity and what's being done in the private sector to really help drive some of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that's happening. I mean, one, minorities and women are finding it increasingly possible to raise capital for themselves. So, venture capital funds, investment funds, entrepreneurs, the climate and the technology sector still is probably dominated by white males, but it was a lot more so in the past. So the capital availability, again, private capital and even focused capital. I think just recently, there was a female run and launched venture fund focused on climate that is starting to do really well. So the availability and the opportunity is growing. And then just awareness of just the reality of what you said. I mean, as an example, in most urban cities, poor neighborhoods are 5 to 10 degrees hotter in the summer than wealthy neighborhoods. And the reason is because of the tree canopy, because real estate developers don't plant trees in poor neighborhoods, right? They just get cut down and the buildings get put up. So there's environmental justice on a microscopic scale that most of the people on this webinar and most people we all know don't really have to interact with day to day. And that the data is now becoming more available, whether it's satellite data or just people putting this stuff up on the internet for the public to read. So awareness is increasing, and you kind of have that availability of catalysts and then awareness, and the fusion of that means that a lot more people can rise up and actually do something about something they care about.
Yeah, totally. And Jen, would love to, get your thoughts on, as part of this administration, right? Where have you seen some of the work that's being done?
Yeah. So one of the things that we are thinking about is, well, it's tricky, right? Because again, coming from the the Office of Carbon Management and Fossil Energy, we're recognizing that a lot of the impacts of the extraction of fossil fuels, but also where are the power plants located? What are the impacts of the mining of coal, for instance, the extraction of natural gas from the Marcellus, the hydraulic fracturing, all of the catalytic cracking that's taking place. And so the fossil fuel industry has really impacted a lot of these communities. And so now that we're looking at technologies of, for instance, carbon capture, this is one of the biggest things, is you don't want to do carbon capture and just enable the further negative impacts of the fossil fuel production. And so some of the investments that we're making are very holistic in that if we're going to do CC and trying to be responsible, so that if we're going to support a CCS project on a power plant, we are asking the question, what is the feedstock that goes into that power plant? How is it recovered out of the earth today? What are the groundwater impacts? What are the ecosystem impacts? And if the answer is that we don't have solutions off the shelf to clean it up, then that project's not going to be supported. And we're also looking at, when you look at direct air capture, that's a very confusing term. I've been trying to be very clear about what it means, that it's different. It's taking CO2 out of the accumulated pool in the atmosphere. That's very different from capturing at an exhaust of a power plant. And this is just a tool that we have to deploy at this point. We don't have a choice. We can't only do it from avoiding emissions. And that's tricky because when you go to communities and you say, we want to do carbon removal from the atmosphere, some equate that to enabling fossil fuels. And so this communication is so important because we're ultimately deploying technologies in communities and at fence lines where they have been impacted and have legacy impacts. And so what we're really trying to do is be thoughtful about the siting of projects, and also that will help to de-risk them too in the future.
Thank you. And there's one question right now coming in, which is they would love to hear a little about the geopolitical benefits of a transition to renewable energy production. And I know, Alyssa, you've been thinking about this, so would love to turn it over to you and to see what thoughts you had.
Yeah, so, and I'm really interested to hear what you all think about this as well. I just heard something recently that really made me think, we've never fought wars over solar, we've never fought wars over wind. There's, again, like a lot of this, I go back to, so much of this it can be very political. And side note, I always say, write your legislator, write your local official, a vote. These things are so very important. But wind and solar and other types of energy generation where we use a natural resource, it's homegrown, right? So we're not talking about importing oil. And if you look in the news right now, this is a very, very important topic, something that's really, really critical for our national security. Think about the US, where even if half of our energy generation came from homegrown, non-polluting resources, and what that would do for our national security, and how relationships would change with countries around the world, and how conflicts can be avoided. I think it's like a fact. What are past, current, and future conflicts in the future? What are they about? They're about resources. They might be about water, about oil. And so I know we don't have a lot of time left, but imagining a future where we have a homegrown, non-polluting resource of energy generation, whether it's wind or solar, and of course whatever other technologies all the smart young people in the future come up with. That seems like a really nice world to live in.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're seeing a trend over here with our administration with a lot of bilat. So we've been having a lot of country level discussions around collaboration. Jen and I were in one together, and so I'm really seeing a desire for collaborations with the U.S. on taking clean energy technologies and trying to get it to the next stage of commercialization. And this really is an all hands on deck across the globe to figure this out, because a lot of it is expensive. A lot of it is technologies maybe sitting in different parts of the globe, and how do we collaborate together? And so I really think this is getting to more of a harmony as we think about, Mother Earth is an Earth. It's all of us. We're all global citizens, and we're really tackle this together. So in the last few minutes, I know that some of the high school class has been encouraged to watch this, and hopefully we'll get a pretty good crowd listening in. But I'd love for each of you to share, what does the future look like for high school students? And what's the one thing that they might be able to do to make a difference? And so Aaron, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, if you care about the environment and the planet, you just got to start getting involved. There are incredible resources out there, summer jobs, long-term jobs, ways to intern, ways to get access to the news that's out there. You just start. With all due respect to the incredible people on this panel, you don't have to be a scientist to get involved. You don't have to be good at math. You don't even have to be good at school. You don't even need good grades to help the planet. You just got to start doing it, figure out how it feels good to you. And whatever that way is, you'll be successful at it.
That's good advice. Jen?
I love that.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there, Aaron. And I agree too. Some ideas can't wait, and not everything involves a ton of education and a PhD. And there's just a lot of opportunities in this space. And there's a place for every thinker, every kind of thinker. And I know that, a lot of we've been focusing on kind of the STEM fields here, but one of the huge gaps that I see is that science communication aspect. The social science aspects. I feel like there's a huge gap. And one of the challenges is going to be for us to move these projects forward. We really need the human capital, and we need the human connection. We need folks that can go out and engage with communities and really help to not get their buy-in, but really help to deploy technologies so that they actually fit in to the values of the community and really try to minimize the environmental and ecosystem impacts. But really just want to emphasize, there's lots of exciting space out there. It's easy to get bogged down in all of the news too that's going on, but I think a little bit of that is okay to fuel the fire, but there's just so much to be positive about right now too.
But we're fueling the fire in a clean way, just to be clear.
There you go. That's right.
So what about you?
Yeah.
Well, I probably just have 30 seconds, but I'll just say, I always tell, young people that I talk to, interns that work with me, you might be working for a really long time, and find something that you care about and that you're passionate about and that, makes a difference in your world and you can feel proud of. I talk to my kids about this all the time. You can imagine we talk a lot about climate around the dinner table. And I love Jen and Aaron, what you said, and your advice was amazing. But I think, finding what you care about, and even just little things make a difference. You think they might not, but, turning off your lights, energy conservation. I also tell my kids this all the time. If everybody took a step for energy conservation, it would make a really, really big impact. So never think that, the little bit that you do is not meaningful, because it absolutely is. And it really takes all of us to manage climate change. And the future is bright, and we're counting on future generations. We really are.
I couldn't agree with that more. I really think it starts with yourself, doing small things, turning off lights. That is a really important thing. And then thinking about, repairing, reusing, recycling, everything you're doing. Carry a water bottle around, right? If we don't have to manufacture more stuff, that's less energy. So think about ways that you can really, decrease your own footprint. And, today was an amazing conversation. I mean, I learned so much myself, and this is an incredible group. And I think, it's amazing. We've got this ecosystem here at SCH. And one other thing I want to let you all know, for those of you who are alums or others listening in, here at the Department of Energy, we are actually actively looking to recruit 1,000 people in order to get us to the clean energy demonstration stage of things, because we got $62 billion from bipartisan infrastructure law. And we need people, we need good people. So if you're interested, literally Google Clean Energy Core, and you'll get a link to the Department of Energy where we're actively looking for folks. Everything from recent graduates to people who've spent decades in this. You know, we need you all here, hands on deck. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for an amazing session. I apologize for those who typed in the Q&A. For some reason, technology didn't work. I was clicking on it and it wouldn't show it to me. I'm sure they were great questions, but we'll follow up at some point with all of you. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Steve.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Jen, Aaron, and Alyssa. I think in summary, what I heard was this is the big next market. And so those of you high schoolers, get ready to be the communicators, be the synthesizers, be the empathizers. I think, Alyssa, as you said, so much of it's getting out and communicating to people to understand that this isn't a political debate. This isn't something to be debated. This is a better world going forward. And there's lots of opportunity for all kinds of different viewpoints, or lots of opportunity for lots of different jobs to make it happen. Great panel. Thank you so much. Katie, final word goes to you.
Thank you so much. That's all I really need to say. I know that a lot of teachers are going to be having their students watch this in the next coming days, and I'm just so thrilled to have you all tonight. So thank you.
Well, thanks. It was great to be here. Learned so much. It's great. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks,
Everybody.
the future is bright.
It is. Thank you.